So we're very fortunate to have an opportunity to speak with Rebecca Galemba, who's an anthropologist based at who's director actually of the Latin American Center at the Josef Korbel School of International Studies at the University of Denver. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, how are you?
Yeah, I'm well. And I asked if you'd agree, if you'd speak with me because of getting very intrigued by the paper that you've written about your experiences as an anthropologist, as a social researcher in the Chiapas area of Mexico. It strikes me that one doesn't necessarily set out in life to be doing a project like that. How did you get there? How did you get to be doing such a fascinating piece of research?
So I guess a lot of it actually started with my research when I was a master's student at Brown University, and I was always very interested in migration in Latin America and in borders, and I ended up doing a small ethnographic study at the US-Mexico border on the Mexican side in Tijuana. And when I was starting my graduate work, that was right kind of in the wake of the events of September 11th, 2001, which in the US context had very much reoriented the entire security frame of how the US was even approaching its trade relations, its foreign policy, the ways it talked about the border, the ways it talked about threat. And I was just very fascinated about how this discourse so quickly was becoming taken for granted. And I actually saw that this year's incoming freshman class in college will be the first year in college born after the events of September 11th, and the way that this discourse has been taken for granted. And so I was very interested of how local populations in the US-Mexico border were understanding these securitized perceptions of threat and borders to populations that have long migrated and transited the border. And so after that, I got really interested in hearing about how a lot of this extending the North American security perimeter, but as well as trade integration that goes along with it, was also now being directed at Mexico's southern border with Guatemala, that Mexico is being asked even more intentionally to collaborate with the United States on these initiatives to more enhance security at its own southern border. And this is something that we hear a lot in the media happening right now, actually, especially under US President Trump, the idea that Mexico is the handmaiden to the US, but this has been ongoing and intermittent for quite some time, but was the first phase that was really intensified was in that post 9/11 period. And so I was just really interested, and there was a real dearth of research of what do people who live in this borderlands that's even more porous, more unclearly defined, family groups and kinship ties that cross this border, how are they going to understand and experience this? And in many cases, obviously, this was historically the condition at the US-Mexico border as well, but one that has unfolded over a longer period of time. It was much more recent and less research at this particular border. And so I really just started going there the summer before I did my research to talk to nonprofit organizations, to talk to academics, to just kind of get a sense of what the borderlands was like. And what you learn is that it's an incredibly long and diverse border. As diverse as the topography of Mexico is, a lot of that is magnified at the border with Guatemala, where you have areas that are plains, you have volcanoes, you have coffee growing regions, you have jungle, and different areas that you can cross. And so I met some local academics and research assistants who had participated in some studies that had been done on other issues at the border, who sort of introduced me to different communities, seeing where I can conduct research. And one of the places that I came upon ended up being this particular what people there actually call an extravío, which in Spanish means almost a deviation or a path that is not the intended one. And so basically this is an unmonitored road that locals constructed largely themselves that connects between the Mexican highway on one side and the Guatemalan highway on the other, but bypassing and diverting from the official inspection point just a few miles down the road. So you can kind of go loop around and come back out the other side without going through inspections. And I just kind of became fascinated by this area and the way that people formed relationships you read an article about how they depend on corn through there, and they trade corn, but also families are interconnected there. It's an area that was impacted by refugee flows from the Guatemalan conflict and resettlement in the 80s and 1990s. And so from an anthropological standpoint, in terms of issues of ethnicity, of kinships, it's also very interesting. And in fact, I started out interested more in migration. And in fact, I found just the issue of migration, largely of Central Americans who might be coming up through this way, were just one part of the diversity of flows and relationships embedded in this particular region. And that's when I ended up studying everything else that was going across this border and in different directions. And actually, in now more recent work, I've sort of come back to the topic of migration.
It's interesting reflecting on that too, because I often think about the anthropological commitment to holism and what that can do. It can send us a bit crazy as researchers because we want to follow absolutely everything we can that's going on there. That kind of vacuum cleaner approach to doing research that can make it difficult when it comes to then selecting what you're going to write about. So tell us about going into this field site. There you are, as you said, you made some initial connections through academic networks or through academics that you got to know in the field. But what was it like? Say, was there a day one? But let's imagine a mythic day one. There you go. I'm starting my doctoral research now. What happened? How did you go about doing it?
So the main person who had shown me around was actually a research assistant who had been on a larger scale project that was looking at communities of former Guatemalan refugees that actually naturalized in Mexico in the late 1990s and how they were faring with their Mexican neighbors. And so one community of the, I believe, 20 or so that they surveyed was one of these communities in the Mexican side of the border. And so he was the one who originally showed me around, helped from a distance, helped me figure out a house to rent in the community so I could live there. And then when I arrived, I basically found out that, the deal on the house wasn't really necessarily what we thought it was. In terms of ethics, I introduced
myself. Now, Rebecca, I'm going to have to stop you there because, in fact, you froze.
Oh no! Okay.
So
where did it freeze?
So where you were at was the house that you got, and it wasn't as you expected it to be. There was something happened to the house.
No, well, I mean, so the man we were renting it from just kind of kept changing the price. And whether he decided he wanted to live in it or not. And that sort of varied back and forth. And then the research assistant who'd introduced me to the communities, I realized that his connections weren't as strong as I thought they were. And so there was one community near the one next to the one I was living in that I also intended to conduct research in, that apparently they had never let them in. They'd kicked journalists out in the past. Even last year when I went to talk at a conference, a binational conference in Chiapas between Guatemalan and Mexican researchers, they talked about being chased out themselves. And so that surprised me. But I think in some ways, in terms of talking about positionality, they never had someone from the United States come there unless they were a missionary or had somehow been married to someone in the United States and been brought back. And so there was somewhat of a curiosity, and as well as being female, I think less of a suspicion. And also coming alone, and then people realizing I wasn't leaving. And so, I lived there for a year, and sometimes I'd go to the city on a weekend or, travel for a week, but largely I was living there with people. Whereas I remember what they said about the previous team. They said, oh, that was that team, that came in for a couple of days, took some pictures, and then we never saw them again. And so I think, once people got to know me and see what I was doing, there was more tolerance and more kind of accepting and opening up. But I also made sure to introduce myself at the community assembly in each community with letters of support of what I was doing. I befriended very quickly whoever was the local community authority to take me house to house as much as possible to introduce me to families. I ended up teaching English like 3 to 4 days a week because each community wanted their own class. And I worked in 5 different communities. And through that is how I really got to know a lot of families. And they sort of taught me how the border works rather than superimposing what the field site is. And I'm sure that's something we learn about in anthropology, is how the ethnographer often superimposes this, and one of the historical problem and even Mexican anthropology is the idea of the closed corporate community, right? This idea that we choose a field site and it's bounded and that's where we focus. But I really learned to see and focus more on these border communities. Well, of course, there's much more we could focus on, right? So I could have followed those commodity flows further as far as they went, but I decided to really focus on the relationships that were forged by dependence on this particular unmonitored crossing. And a lot of that was brought to my attention, not necessarily by looking at the commerce, that came a lot later, and by really getting to know people who just taught me about what they did, was by actually meeting families who, like Ramon, who's a pseudonym who you read about in the article, who took me on that trip to find corn and sell it to his uncle. I met him because his niece was in my English course, and they offered to have my husband and I over for dinner, and we got to know them. And he said, let me introduce you to my grandparents and to my uncle. And then realizing that they lived on the Guatemalan side of the border, and then how all of these kind of relationships were intertwined across the border really emerged that way. But that being said, of course, there were people who suspected my presence or wouldn't talk to me. And consent, as you learn in ethnographic research, isn't a one-time thing. It's an ongoing process. I remember the community that was more closed, that I mentioned had kicked out researchers in the past. All of a sudden they said I couldn't come to their assembly meetings. Some people were hesitant to talk to me. Actually, at that point in the research, I even lived in that community right next door to the community center. And when I realized what had happened is that local authorities in these rural communities rotate pretty frequently, every 1 to 2 years. And the previous authority, who really understood what I was doing and was helping me, I realized he never gave the documents to anyone because he actually couldn't read them. So he never bothered to give them to the new authorities. And when you have people who've been out of the community or migrating, not everyone is always aware of what you were doing. And so the new authorities were much more hesitant. So I kind of had to reestablish that consent. That being the case, with any of these trades, there sometimes is a degree of suspicion, a degree of closeness. In my book, I talk about this more, where I really don't go into the drug trade at all. I don't ask those questions. And, we hear through rumor, suspicion, we can surmise how those trades work based on how other commerce works at the same time. But knowing that not to place myself or those I'm working with at risk. But more recently, from what I've heard, especially being back as recently as last year, it has become a riskier place to be. And some issues are much more difficult to talk about than they were a decade ago when I first conducted this research, where Mexico's real escalation of the drug war really began around 2006, 2007, which is really the crux of when I was conducting my research. So while a lot of what we hear about in the news about, drug cartels splintering off and these, situations of violence and splintering, a lot of that really wasn't quite underway yet. It was just kind of starting to bubble at that particular time.
Yes, and I guess that was something I was thinking about when I was reading the paper about those not quite distant echoes, but not far off rumblings that were there, and of course the structurating force that they have, the ways in which they were helping set up scenes for a kind of a tolerance of this illicit trade is a fascinating dimension of it. So let's get to that. You're right of the effects of free trade agreements between Mexico and USA. And as I've been suggesting to students, go and look at what the World Trade Organization, the IMF, have to say about free trade and its importance. And anybody who goes in there will see that they're saying this is the way out of poverty. Free trade is necessary if this is going to happen. Now, of course, I do always suggest to students we need to think statistically about any kind of claims that we're making in this regard. What does your research suggest about such claims?
And who they're impacting. And, so I went back to look at, some of that information about free trade. And in fact, Mexico loves free trade. Mexico, I believe, has signed, I think, more free trade agreements than any other country in the world, or they're pretty close. Last time I looked, one of their former presidents said, the more the better. They are an enthusiastic supporter, but really the evidence, again, as you say, look at the statistics of what happened to Mexico, is we really haven't seen the results in terms of poverty alleviation, in terms of growth. While Mexico's GDP has grown, its poverty has largely in many of these areas remained stagnant. Inequality is extremely high. It's, you know, one of the most unequal countries in the OECD. And so many have actually argued when you look at statistics is that NAFTA has actually made Mexico more unequal and aggravated poverty and entrenched it, especially among the rural poor and subsistence farmers. So basically accentuating the differences that already existed in Mexico rather than providing a path out of poverty. And, you know, a lot of these impacts were largely due to the kind of massive undercutting of Mexican agriculture, the decimation of peasant livelihoods, as you read about in the article. And, you know, many argue that this would be temporary. All the other jobs that have been brought in by free trade would make up for this. But it has come nowhere close to make up for that deficit, and really fails to understand these kind of underlying problems of underdevelopment in the countryside, where there is no foreign investment still, where there are very few pathways out of poverty. And I think the other question is to look at what is free trade. And that's what I find so interesting of what I was alerted to from everyday people, some of who understood the agreement, some who misunderstood it completely, as you saw in the article. But they really raised a question of the fact that these free trade agreements aren't actually free. There's still requirements to participate. There's still paperwork. In many cases, there's still tariffs and duties, albeit reduced. What some have argued, it makes trade much freer for corporations, for big businesses, and actually more difficult for everyday people, for farmers, for small businesses who are then unable to compete. And what you see in Mexico largely is that, you know, NAFTA was in many cases seen as a way to kind of leverage the losses from the debt crisis into financial benefits. It was largely negotiated on both sides of the border between financial and business and elite interests, to the detriment of workers not only in Mexico, but many in the United States as well. And so I think that raises the question of, you know, who is benefiting? So if we look at free trade, you know, growth versus inequality, looking at poverty, looking at standards of living, but also looking at what segments of society are benefiting, and who is free to participate in free trade. If it were actually legitimately free, would be probably a different discussion, especially between two countries that were on such uneven playing fields to begin with, between the US and Mexico.
Yeah, that's right. Your move kind of thing. I mean, I think that there's. It would be helpful just to tease out a little bit of the historical legacies here, because you write about, is it CONASUPO, the National Company of Popular Subsistence? CONASUPO, of course. I've got to get my accent right, don't I?
Okay.
But so I assume that was a, well, by now it's an artifact of a nationalist government, of the state, that as it was before liberalization, as you're calling it. So it'd be helpful just to get a little bit of that background detail, I think, because I imagine that I get this image in your paper about people being a bit bewildered, you know, about that kind of a shift that's happened, the guaranteed corn prices and all of that.
Right. And so a lot of and it's interesting. And again, corn is the product, to back up a step, that it is most traded at this particular border. You know, it's not just one I picked out of the blue. There's a lot of different, obviously anything that can be put in a truck can cross the border. As I've learned, I've seen even Ferris wheels being trafficked across the border. How did that get there? And I'm not sure that we want to ride that. But corn is the most common. And then I think that it's most common because, and it's symbolic at the same time, as you read in the article, it's symbolic, it's necessary, it's part of life, it's part of culture, and it's also part of Mexican nationalist identity, which is, it's a real window into, I think, what the peasantry was experiencing, both literally on the ground of where are we going to sell our corn because the government no longer buys it from us, as well as a symbol of the betrayal that farmers felt with the decimation of Mexico's corporatist politics and government, and failures to really transition to substantive democracy, right? And so I think there's this, you know, if they're going to, with the there was a lot of hopes of the democratic transition that have largely often been these kind of unfulfilled promises where there's a raise of hope every election cycle, kind of more of the same. Actually, Monique Nguyen has called this kind of hope generating machine, actually, to describe the kind of Mexican political system. But Mexico is quite unusual in terms, especially of Latin America, where the same party was in power for 71 years, the PRI, as its acronym is called, which is basically a center-left party. Mexico never technically had a dictatorship like you see in some of the countries of the southern cone of Central America. But many would argue, again, it had a very tight grip on politics, on dissent, on the economy of even social and peasant and worker organizations by tying them to the state, by always mixing a combination of selective repression against those who acted against the state, but as well as ways of placating groups by forming, peasant organizations that were tied to the state, workers organizations that were tied to the state, and being able to distribute the largest of the state to kind of keep the population in line. And, Mexico had elections every 6 years, but they called the dedazo, the kind of finger, like I point to you, right? This is my successor. And a part of that was obviously Conosupo is part of that, the way that Mexico integrated support for farmers and agriculture into this corporatist policy. So really having control over the entire chain and being able to give farmers a guaranteed price and outlet to sell their harvest, as well as keeping prices low for consumers of tortillas at the same time. And so in many cases, that was part of, the symbol of Mexico's commitment to agriculture, to its rural population. Of course, that's in its idealized, that's not, of course, there were, problems with it, but in terms of how the peasantry saw the relationship to the state. And what you really have, especially, I'm not going to go through all Mexican history, but especially in the 1980s, you really see, I think the corporatist system had been falling apart really since the recession in the 70s, even since the 1960s, but it really came to a head with the 1982 debt crisis in Mexico, and Mexico defaulted on its debt, was forced to accept, these austerity packages to augment privatization and neoliberalism. And so, many talk about NAFTA, but NAFTA was not until the mid-1990s. Yes. A lot of these processes to liberalize agriculture, to privatize land, really began much earlier, and especially the gradual dismantling of the state support for farmers, for communal land holdings, for supportive agriculture. And so what many would argue, and I forget who actually said these words, but that NAFTA was more the nail in the coffin rather than, something existing in isolation. It kind of cemented that this is the way things are going. But you gradually have the state dismantling of supports for agriculture in the 80s to prepare the way for NAFTA, as well as you have the constitutional changes that said we are no longer going to distribute land reform, which had been emblematic of Mexico's constitution. And so farmers really saw this as a betrayal of the state, especially in areas like Chiapas, where land reform had been slow and incomplete to begin with, as well as allowing for the privatization of communal lands to be sold. And so that was also an impact on agriculture. But largely you see through the 80s and 90s, this being dismantled to the late 1990s, most of these warehouses that used to buy the harvest from farmers, most of them at guaranteed prices, largely abandoned. In so many cases, as I mentioned, farmers and locals will point to where they used to be, and sometimes the building is still standing, but they're no longer in operation anymore.
Yeah, so it stands as a kind of grand symbol of the changes that have taken place from a form of state paternalism to this apparently freer world. Take responsibility for yourself, that kind of thing. So of course people have to get by and make do.
Way more expensive at the same time, and so yes. Without buying farmers' corn, or when they did, they're basically undercut by the influx of cheap corn from the U.S. coming in, which Mexico had the opportunity to actually phase out the tariffs more gradually. They just decided not to. Largely, I think at the bequest of big agriculture and some of the firms that were benefiting from this influx of corn, largely the milling firms to make tortillas. And so I think, that is part of that as well.
Yeah, so cheap corn from the US you make that point, I think, through King's study in your paper about
Yeah.
well, if we can't be competitive with corn,
right.
What the hell can we be competitive about?
And the irony is that the US subsidizes its farmers. And so that's the ultimate, free trade irony. And people are well aware of that. And, that's something to mention too, is that, many people in these communities have a lot of experience in the United States, including working in agriculture as migrant workers. And so they clearly understand that this discourse, when you look at it from how it's practically applied, is not something that actually makes practical sense to the people who are experiencing it. It's not what they build it as. But part of, again, the changes that the state made in terms of increased austerity and even decreasing of the minimal social nets that were already there was that a lot of inputs became more expensive. Price of basic foodstuffs increased. The real minimum wage made it more difficult. The price of fuel went up. And so, again, people are getting the price went down for what farmers could actually sell their products for, if they could sell them at all. Meanwhile, the cost of many of these inputs had gone up.
Yeah. And I was also intrigued by how, this business of state infrastructure. So when state paternalism goes, so local infrastructure becomes also a responsibility of local communities. And I was struck by how you were talking about how you wrote about the levies that also get put upon the trade. So you get the really interesting creative responses in lots of ways to the new emerging and now more set in place sort of responses to this. So I think that's a fascinating element of it. And perhaps we could just tease that out a little bit. I mean, the paper's there to be read, and it captures so much of this so beautifully, so very well. But this business about people then being able to turn the discourse around or to use it to their advantage and to say, we are involved in free trade. This is free trade. So
but there's ironies and contradictions to it as well, I think, which the article points out, especially through corn, is that there is this discourse that anyone should be able to trade corn. It's a basic grain. It shouldn't even be taxed. But of course, they're still taxing these trucks. There is that whole now parking lot of truckers that are local that are trying to monopolize the trade for themselves. So there are exclusions embedded within that. And the ultimate irony is a lot of the corn that they truck, and when there's no corn locally, is actually that corn coming down from the United States and northern Mexican states, that they are actually facilitating that. And it's similar with the tolls. And so I think I've sort of changed the way I saw a lot of the practices in which locals were engaged in when I was in the field, and even writing that article to when I wrote the book, where it's very easy to see these as forms of resistance to the state that has very rarely acted in their interests. And in fact, even when there were promises to do so in terms of corporatism, obviously they saw the double face of corporatism, and now obviously it's complete abandonment at the same time, in being areas that are both very marginal on the Guatemalan side as well to either national center of power, and clearly knowing that there's money to be made at borders to tax goods, but they rarely end up benefiting or developing the communities that they pass through. And so part of those tolls are in many cases a way of reclaiming state functions, of almost proto-state formation, of saying, we live here, we're the ones who maintain the road. These are taxes, right, that we use for our own community development. But at the same time, they mimic a lot of the logics of the state that they critique at the same time. This idea of, these territorial lines, ways that identity and belonging and taxation go together, the way that they sometimes take this local control, sometimes facilitates the continuing state neglect, is something that I've explored in other pieces, where it also fosters a lot of these still patron-client relationships that oftentimes smugglers and more powerful community members have with particular corrupt authorities, which actually prevents, in many cases, change that would actually be more beneficial to the communities at large from taking hold in these particular areas.
Something that I think would be helpful for students in this area to understand is what it means to be a peasant in 21st century Mexico.
Hmm.
Because I imagine that's where picks up a whole
Mm-hmm.
lot of shifts as well.
Well, it's changed a lot, and I think this quote is in the article when there's the peanut merchant who says, you know, now my truck is my machete. This idea that, you know, we all still identify as campesinos, and so, you know, even a family that I lived with, they smuggle coffee and sugar, they tend some cattle. Maybe they have a small part of land, but they will still tell you that they're farmers, that they're campesinos, that they're peasants. And so this is still an
Mm.
identity of a tie to the land, a tie to your community. But farming in many cases has, in many communities, become untenable as a form of livelihood, but it also has for quite some time. And so that even just goes back to historically the ways that especially indigenous populations and poor populations in many areas of Latin America, but in Chiapas in particular, have been gradually pushed off their lands historically and have had to always mix agriculture with some form of migratory wage labor. And so many of the, you know, smugglers or merchants that are also farmers, the way that they sometimes got by as youth was by migrating to the coast, the southern Chiapas coast, to pick coffee seasonally. Or many people, their relatives migrated up to the Yucatan, where, you know, near Cancun, right, to work in the resorts, or now increasingly to the United States. And so while people may identify still as campesinos and say fewer and fewer people farming in many of these marginalized areas has never been enough to sustain families. There's always been a reliance on multiple livelihood strategies, of which petty commerce, especially in border regions, has always been one. That's not new, but it has intensified, and it's even growing as a form of identity at the border, as well as people who engage in business, as people who know trucking, and that has become a new niche that is developed, but one that still exists alongside farming. And I think, you know, that's something that many people take with pride. And so there are increasing amount of people who go to technical high school or even university, but to get any of those jobs, again, it's very hard to get any of those professional jobs in Mexico, period. But it's almost impossible to work one and still remain home on your land
Yeah.
with your family and your community. And in fact, engaging in some of these kind of smuggling or business petty commerce enables people to still do both. Of saying, well, if there's no business today, I'll go tend my fields, or I still have my land, even though I don't farm it anymore. And so it is still a part of life, even if it is not the main form of subsistence for many people anymore, in this region at least.
Right, right. You know, Rebecca, there's so many threads that I'd love to pick up on, but I think it's time to draw this to conclusion. Perhaps we can do a part 2 sometime and talk about gender relations, because I think that would be, I'm sure there's many a fascinating thing, and perhaps that's also just something for people to consider reading further about as well.
Mm-hmm.
How are things looking now? Let's close around that note. How do you see the scene there? And of course, you've only got a few minutes. Huh?
Yeah, I mean, so the last time I was back was a year ago, and every time I've gone back, I've actually been surprised, because what you keep hearing in the media about the closing off of the border, the increasing securitization against drug trafficking, every time I've gone back since, there's actually been more and more of these smuggling activities, larger trucks, more and more out in the open. One of the activities that had attracted the most attention had actually been gasoline smuggling. And that did result at one point in a very kind of high profile raid, but then gradually kind of dissipated to these kind of relationships between state officials and peasants, whereby people just started doing more frequent trips and less visible quantities. And in fact, the last time I went, because of changing dynamics, especially in Mexico's privatization of the fuel industry, then the gasoline was actually going the other way, which was actually really surprising. It had always gone from Mexico to Guatemala, and a year and a half ago it was going back the other way. But a few things that I noticed, and one that I mentioned to you earlier, is the kind of more eerie presence of the drug trade. You see many large houses going up that it's it's more and more untenable that that's just from smuggling coffee and sugar. People wondering what else are people transporting in their trucks. A few more high profile incidents of people being shot, killed either there or nearby, not a lot, but a few, most saying these are mistaken identities or this person was involved in something. A few friends who've since moved away and kind of been more hesitant to talk about why they moved away. And a lot of this has to do with a lot of the kind of decapitation or imprisonment, actually the decline of the some of the more high profile cartels like the Zetas, like the Vitorcano cartel, and sometimes local groups actually filling in and competing over those gaps. And so there is, I think, more involvement, but again, one that I was more hesitant to ask about. And the other one, I think, and this is something that I'm looking, hopefully, if we ever get to travel again, is the impacts of climate change on making life even more difficult in this area, which is something one of the most intensely impacted areas actually in this region is Western Guatemala, in Huehuetenango. And in fact, you see a lot of similar patterns coming in Chiapas, where now you're seeing spikes of people leaving from Mexico, not just from the rising violence that we see, but also from the impacts of climate on coffee rust, so entire crops being decimated, on food insecurity. And, and I was there very briefly, but, one thing I just noticed was how parched the entire hillsides were. And again, this was never a very fertile area. This is a very dry area where, again, that's why people were so dependent on corn, because they would say, well, nothing else will grow here. And in fact, the rains hadn't come, the corn wasn't coming when it was even supposed to come. And so, I think many of those livelihood options are getting even more stressed upon by these impacts of violence in the area, of climate change, and as well as some of these areas, even the impact, and this is a kind of another topic, but in nearby regions, the impact of extractive development projects as well in these areas, like dams, like mines, that are also pushing people out of their communities into the brink of their reliance on the land, with really no other legitimate tenable other alternatives that have come into play. And now, with migration to the US being more difficult, deportations, people returning, was something I was seeing more and more as well in the years after I did the original field work.
So remittances as well are now starting to diminish as well, I can imagine.
What I saw was I saw a really strong impact of that when I returned right after the 2009 recession, around 2010, 2011, where people were saying, it wasn't worth going anymore. People were returning. They were actually trying to say, well, maybe now they'd heard about kind of all these business opportunities to get a truck and engage in business. And, when they arrived, it wasn't what they necessarily thought it would be. I haven't necessarily tracked what the remittances are doing now because of COVID. I think, there's these different pressures, but those, once that is relieved, people will still have that desire to migrate. And in fact, many of these communities took pride for many years of the fact that an initial migration trip might help you invest in a business or buy a truck. But then if you did okay, you didn't have to make as many repeat or long trips as people they knew in other communities. But I'm not necessarily sure that that's holding up anymore, or that migration to the U.S. is reliable a strategy, given the higher costs and risks involved. Although people will still do it and still wanting to go, still have a lot of family here. There were a lot of rumors circulating last time about, will the border close? If I bring children, am I allowed in? There's a lot of also misinformation that's going alongside the desperation to leave at the same time.
Yeah. To make do and get by now in all of those different it's not myriad ways, it's actually limited ways. I think that's part of what you're really highlighting, pointing us to, in all sorts of ways. Rebecca, thank you so much.
Thank you.
I know for the students I work with, this will be a very informative, it's great to get this extra background, and hopefully there'll be others out there interested in hearing this story and picking up further.
Oh, great.
And of course, picking up some of the other writing you've done in this area. You were showing me the book before we started to speak, which is titled?
Yeah, so the book is titled Contraband Corridor, Making
Hey,
a Living.
you need to put it up to the camera.
Oh, sorry. Okay. contraband corridor, making a living at the Mexico-Guatemala border. And so this picture was actually in the chapter you read, but here it is actually in color, which is kind of nice to see. And so the book actually has a chapter that is very close, but a little bit different than the article you read, but focuses a lot. There's a whole chapter on those tariff chains that you talked about, on how people try to document and get national documents in both Guatemala and Mexico for their children to have multiple options. There's a lot on the coffee trade, a little bit of migration, as well as on these kind of multiple livelihood strategies that often cross legal and illegal lines, as well as the ways that, while these trades often tend to be either criminalized and or ignored, there's a whole chapter of how they're actually, in many cases, actually beneficial to many of the formal businesses and transnational capital in the region, whereas the people that are the protagonists in this book are often the ones taking the most risks and are really just, largely making ends meet. And in fact, there's many, you hear the success stories, you don't tend to hear those who fail. And again, there's a lot of risk to being involved, both financially and in terms of arrests, accidents, violence that's involved, that's largely born for people that are smuggling goods that are often legitimate in and of themselves, like corn and coffee, for sometimes large scale industries and enterprises that then enter legal commodity chains, where that risk is not borne at those levels. So there's a chapter that talks about that in the book as well.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rebecca. Really great to catch
Great.
up with
Thank
you.
you.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks for inviting me.